Hello, welcome to Train Signal. This is the Managing Client Settings lesson in the System Center 2012 Configuration Manager training course. We'll start this lesson by talking about some changes that have taken place in the client settings arena since the days of old of Configuration Manager. In other words, what's new? Next, we'll talk about managing client settings and exploring client settings and options. We'll take a look at some of the client settings that are necessary for Global Mantics to complete their work. By the end of this lesson, you'll understand the various ways by which Configuration Manager clients can be managed, and you'll understand the role that client settings play in that process. From a business goals perspective, you'll learn how to best manage clients for Global Mantics, and you'll be able to leverage this knowledge to improve Global Mantics desktop operations. So what are client settings? Well, they are centrally configurable options that allow the administrator to granularly control how clients operate in the Configuration Manager environment. They control anything and everything to do with a client. There is a lot that's changed in Configuration Manager with regard to client settings, most notably exactly the level at which they operate. In System Center Configuration Manager 2007, client agents were managed in each individual site. As you can see by the green and blue boxes, there were different client agent configurations for each different site in the Configuration Manager hierarchy. This was sometimes a reason that organizations may have split apart their Configuration Manager environment. As I've said before in this course, and as I'll probably say again, Microsoft tried to eliminate a number of the use cases around the need to split the Configuration Manager hierarchy for purely administrative reasons. As such, in Configuration Manager 2012, client settings are managed at the hierarchy level, not in individual sites. So regardless of the number of sites you have a single set of client settings that you can use. However, you can create as many different copies of client settings and apply them wherever you like throughout the Configuration Manager hierarchy now. But you don't have to. If you have 3 sites, you can use a single set of client settings. Although at first it may not seem like it, moving client settings to the hierarchy level actually adds a lot of flexibility to the environment. Here's why. Before, every site had its own set of client agent settings. Remember, these were called client agents before. Microsoft now calls them client settings, just as a nomenclature change. With Configuration Manager 2012, you can have a master set of client settings. But then, for just those settings that you want to adjust, you can create custom client settings for those items. You don't have to create an entirely new set of client settings just to override one change. When you create custom client settings, you don't automatically override all of the standard client settings. Only those settings that are different than the default client settings are overridden. And that's key here. So let's say you want to change just one little piece of the default settings for one collection, for example. Well, now you can do that. You don't have to worry about creating an entirely new site or having to do some crazy workaround just to meet an administrative need. Custom client settings can actually be applied to specific collections in Configuration Manager 2012. Now you may wonder, well, if you can have all these custom client settings, what happens if there's a conflict? Well, these are resolved through the use of a value in the priority column, which you'll see in just a minute. A lower number in the priority column for client settings means that that particular setting has a higher priority. And that's why at the bottom of the page you see the graphic. 1 is greater than 2, is greater than 3, is greater than 10,000. Most client settings are focused on devices, but a couple are also focused on users. When you really think about it, client settings make sense to be focused on devices. In general, Configuration Manager is managing clients, not users. So the fact that the client settings are focused on those devices actually does make sense. Global Mantics is going to make a couple of changes to the client settings in their own environment. First of all, they're going to change the default policy polling interval to 30 minutes, so the clients will get their policy updates on a different schedule than the default. They're going to establish default computer agent settings and then review some of the remaining available client settings. However, This is not something that you want to sit here and watch every single client setting swing by. That can get really, really boring. Therefore, rather than making you sit here and watch until your eyes bleed, there's a PDF document included with this course that outlines the client settings and the options associated with each one, so that you can read at your leisure and then just focus on the ones that are necessary rather than every single one in the environment. In other places in this course, you are going to be making heavy use of client settings. So if you don't learn every single little thing there is to know about client settings right here, right now, that's okay. And that's actually intentional. For example, when we talk about endpoint protection, we'll be working with the endpoint protection client settings later in this course. In other places in this course, we'll work with other client settings. The purpose here is to set the framework for the rest of the course and just make sure you understand how client settings operates. Once again, we are over at the Global Mantic Configuration Manager console. It's a beautiful sight, isn't it? Client settings are part of the administration area, and you're going to see that I've already got client settings selected along with default client settings here. This is the default set of client settings that comes with a default installation of Configuration Manager, if that's enough defaults for you. You're going to see that we have a priority of 10,000. Basically, what this says is anything you create that overrides this is going to be lower than 10,000. So any settings we create will override whatever settings are in the default client settings. But let's review the defaults. We'll right-click the default client settings and choose Properties. On the client policy page, right now the client policy polling interval is every 60 minutes. Well, I said we want to make this every 30 minutes. We want to have our clients update their policy a little bit more often. And what this means is that they're going to check into Configuration Manager more often to see if there's any updates that they need to know about. I also said I want to update the default computer agent settings. We at least want to review these to make sure that they make sense for Global Mantic. So what we're seeing here is a lot of settings that we're also going to see and be manipulating later on in this course. So we won't do everything, but let's take a look at what we've got. We have deployment deadline greater than 24 hours. Then we remind the user every 48 hours. What that says is when there's a software deployment or other kind of deployment, if there's a deadline greater than 24 hours, we're going to remind the user every couple of days that they need to be taking action to get that software installed. But what we're really most interested in are some of the organizational name pieces that we have here. So we have organization name deployed in the Software Center, or displayed in the Software Center. Well, our organization name is Global Mantic. So we're going to set that value here. We could do it again later on when we decide to actually start deploying software, but let's do it as a part of this initial configuration process. The rest of the settings are perfectly fine that we have here for the computer agents. But let's take a quick peek at the rest of the settings. We're not going to go through them in detail. Again, there's a PDF document associated with this course. But let's see what we've got. We have background intelligent transfer settings. These are settings that are going to apply to clients in the hierarchy, and you can modify them if you'd like to. This is going to make sure that we have the right kind of bandwidth controls in place for Configuration Manager clients. Then we have the default settings for client policy, which we just looked at. Do we have compliance settings? Yes, we do. This is going to be how clients retrieve their compliance settings to make sure that they're staying established against baseline norms. If we have a restart, how should the user be notified? If we're using endpoint protection, which is not installed yet in our environment, how is that going to operate? Are we going to allow Configuration Manager to even manage endpoints protection? Right now, no. Do we want to automatically remove previously installed anti-malware solutions? If this was installed, then yes, we would want to do that. How should the hardware inventory act? Do we want to even enable the hardware inventory? Now, the hardware inventory is a wonderful tool. If you have people that are making hardware changes, you can actually track those hardware changes over time. For mobile devices, are we going to allow users to enroll mobile devices? What's the polling interval for those mobile devices? If we're using network access protection, are we even using it? Power management. This is something that was a big deal in Configuration Manager 2007 R3. It's now part of the base product in Configuration Manager 2012. Do we want to power manage devices? In general, we probably do. Do we want to allow users to exclude their devices from power management? The whole purpose of power management is so that users have to adhere to power policies in the organization. So let's not let them. How are remote tools going to operate? This is something we'll look at later on in this course, but you can see there's a lot of settings here. If you're interested in learning more about these, please review the associated PDF document. How will client computers deploy software? How does software inventory work? Are we going to use software metering? Software updates. This is things like Windows updates. How are those going to operate? State messaging and user and device affinity. There's a whole bunch of different defaults here that we can use. And we've set the two that we're interested in. We changed the default policy polling interval to 30 minutes, and we established the default computer agent settings that we really wanted, which was the name of the company. But let's say, just for fun, you wanted to create a custom client setting for some reason. Well, to do that, right-click Client Settings and choose Create Custom Client Device Settings. Notice there's Client Device Settings and Client User Settings. Right now, we're interested in Client Device Settings. And you're going to see that these are all of the various settings that we can enforce on devices. We're going to call this just Sample, because we're not going to keep these. And we're going to have a different client policy for this particular custom device. And we'll click OK. And you're going to see that this gets a priority of 1. Well, we could keep it there. We could change it if we want to. But for now, we're just going to right-click it, and we're going to choose Properties. You'll see that the only thing we have here is a client policy. And if I wanted to, I could change this to 10 minutes. So these devices, anything associated with them, would then have their policy checked every 10 minutes. Now, I'm going to right-click my new client setting, and I'm going to deploy it. Well, where do I want to deploy it? I want to deploy it against all systems. This is a catch-all collection that was created when we installed Configuration Manager. Now, again, I'm not going to keep this particular setting because if we're going to deploy it against all systems, we may as well make it a default. But I just want to show you that we can actually have different settings for different uses. So it's telling us it's being used by a deployment right now. But the only thing that's in here is one setting. We didn't have to create an entire slew of settings and then try to replicate them from all over the place to try to keep things straight. We can just have the settings that we want associated with this particular client setting. Now if we go to the Deployments tab, we'll see that it's deployed against all systems. And if I wanted to remove it, I can remove it. And then the client settings will revert back to the defaults. And then I can delete that custom or that sample setting area if I like. And that's how client settings work in Configuration Manager 2012. It really can't get a whole lot easier than this. And it's a far cry from what it used to be in older versions. In this lesson, we talked about some changes to client settings, particularly the fact that they're now hierarchy tools rather than site tools. Then we learned how to manage the client settings that are available in the Configuration Manager environment. And we explored the client settings and options in very little detail, but please refer to the PDF document for more detail. And bear in mind, we will be going over many more client settings throughout this course. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.